Hello, everybody, and welcome from the French seaside to this, our second session to introduce to you the draft implementation plan for the ocean decade. I'd like to thank you all for joining us virtually. I hope you're all well and healthy. And I'm very pleased to let you know that we have 250 people registered for today's session. 202 of you have already joined, and we expect more to be joining a little bit later. You might know that we also had a session earlier in the week. We had well over 300 people who joined us then. My name is Linwood Pendleton. I'm a member of the Executive Planning Group, the EPG. And the EPG was established as an advisory board to support the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission with the preparatory phase for the decade. I'm very pleased to be your moderator for today's session. For the last year and a half, many of you have been actively involved in this preparatory phase for the decade, and we call it the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And that last part is very important to us. You've participated in a number of workshops, meetings, and events, and now we're ready to approach the final steps of the process. Today, we want to present to you the implementation plan for the Ocean Decade and give you a chance to ask questions about the plan and the proposed framework for achieving the decade's vision and objectives. These two remote sessions this week were put forward following the cancellation of the second global planning meeting due to the current coronavirus outbreak. These sessions aren't meant to replace the full scope of what we were aiming to achieve during that three-day face-to-face meeting. It won't provide the same opportunity for interaction among the participants, but we'll tell you more in the presentation about how we plan to do that. Rather, this virtual session is part of the process of completing what's officially known as the consultation process, which is an important part of the finalization of the implementation plan so we can get on with the decade. In addition to these remote meetings, as I mentioned, the decade is developing a series of alternate plans that'll unroll over the course of the year. And all of this information will be shared with you through the normal decade communication channels, including the website. Now, we have a very busy agenda today, and I want to introduce you to my co-presenters. We have with us Vladimir Ryabinin, who is the IOC Executive Secretary, Karen Evans, a member of the Decade's Executive Planning Group, Yevgenia Kostanaya, who is a member of the Early Career Ocean Professional Community, who's been working with us throughout, and Alison Clausen from the IOC Secretariat, who works in the Marine Policy and Regional Coordination Unit. The agenda today is divided into 5 segments, but overall it'll follow the structure of the implementation plan, which you had access to through a link that we shared with you after completing your registration. Before we get started, there are a few logistical details I want to pass along to you. As the participant, you may have noticed that you're automatically muted for the duration of the webinar. However, you are invited to share your questions by typing them into the question box, starting right from the beginning. Now, keep in mind that these are questions about the implementation plan and about the presentation. We won't be able to answer technical questions about your audio or things like that. And if you have comments, but not questions, we'll offer you another opportunity to make those comments closer to the end when we describe to you a survey that we would like you to engage in. So as you have questions, please note that we will ask some questions at the end of each session, and we will hold some questions to the end. I really encourage you to put your questions in the question box as they occur to you, so you don't forget them, and so I can keep track of them. We recognize that we won't have time to answer every question, but we know this session is about you, and I assure you that all your questions will be carefully reviewed and taken into consideration as we complete the review process for the implementation plan. This PowerPoint presentation, as well as a recording of the session, will be made available on the Decade website later this week. And after the session, you'll receive a follow-up email with all the details about how to access this presentation and that PowerPoint. Now I want to turn it over to Vladimir Ryabinin to share with us the latest update on the preparatory phase, and as well to present to us the vision for the Ocean Decade. Over to you, Vladimir.
Thank you very much, Linwood, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, dear listeners. I hope that we all soon or sooner or later will overcome the coronavirus, and which is the real near-term priority for the world, And as soon as we have done so, the issues of long-term sustainability and the ocean will be again back on the radar screen of decision makers and the whole world. The proclamation of the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, 2021-2030, by the United Nations in the 73rd session of General Assembly in December 2017 is a major development. It means that 195 nations of the world consider ocean science as a priority for the civilization at the beginning of the third millennium. So the IUC of UNESCO, now from now on we will call ourselves IUC, was given the task of inviting everyone and proposing an inclusive path to the positive question, answer to the question, is there a way to reverse the decline in ocean health and to continue to rely on the ocean for our needs, particularly under the changing climate? So the idea was to involve many stakeholders, countries, United Nations agencies, science organizations, private sector, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, philanthropists, holders of traditional knowledge. We had to do it, and this is one of the most important principles of the decade. We have to do this in the gender and age balanced way. And the question for us always has been, have we involved all? I would say no, but we really have involved many. So now when I say we, it is also you and the whole community of those who will be moving forward the plan. So we also needed core leaders, and I would like to recognize here the immense contribution of the executive planning group. We started with the six interim members of the group, and then we had 20 thought leaders in different areas of ocean activities, ocean science managers, and many other types of experts. So I thank EPG for the contribution. Also, we have a special group of representative of UN agencies. We still have to deliver, and we have good intentions to involve major UN agencies in this process. So this slide presents to you a global mobilization situation for us. Between May 2019 and this month, no, actually March 2020, we conducted global, thematic, and 9 out of 11 planned regional meetings in different parts of the world, with more than 1,000 participants in all these meetings. So we had 3 meetings in the Pacific, in the workshop in the Indian Ocean, North and South Atlantic, Mediterranean Sea, for the Arctic, in Africa, and we are preparing now 2 virtual meetings for the Caribbean and again for the Arctic. So important support was received from many people and many organizations. I would like to particularly thank the governments of Belgium and more precisely Flanders, Canada, Japan, Norway, the Republic of Korea, Sweden, UK for the direct support for the planning phase. So you know, this decade is starting now, and it will continue for 10 years. And of course, this is also a decade for everyone, but particularly for young people. So young career ocean professionals, we call them ECOPs, came together, and this group has been extremely active in the preparatory phase. And I would like to invite here one of the representatives of this group, Evgenia Kostyanaya. And maybe Evgenia, you can say a few words about the position and involvement of so-called ECOPs in the preparation of the decade. Evgenia, please.
Thank you, Vladimir, and hello, everyone. My name is Evgenia Kostyanaya. I'm a core member of the Late Career Ocean Professional ECOP informal working group that the IOC established last year in order to address the important task of making the UN Decade of Ocean Science a truly intergenerational process, both in the design and implementation phases. Since the inception of the idea for our group during the first global planning meeting in Copenhagen last year, we have placed particular emphasis on the importance of achieving demographic, gender, racial, professional, and generational representativity in all of our activities, in order to ensure that everyone is engaged and has equal opportunities to generate, assimilate, and transfer knowledge. Over the last few months, we have prioritized the following areas of work. We launched a global survey, which actually closed this Monday, where ECOPS identified areas of scientific and capacity development priorities for the ocean decade. We have actually received 1,428 responses from more than 100 nations, which will provide important data on geographic and demographic variability in the perceived priorities for the decade. We seek to publish the results as a report and a peer-reviewed publication later this year. We have worked to identify existing professional networks which support ECOPS and actually expanded our core and formal working group from 5 to 43 members. We have participated in a series of regional and global high-level planning meetings and contributed to the development of the Decade Science Action Plan and provided input to the draft implementation plan. Our group has contributed to this draft by proposing 5 areas of engagement for ECOPS. This is training, which includes the development of ocean training programs, networking, development of a UN Decade ECOP network, which connects existing early career networks, information portal aimed at ensuring engagement and contribution of ECOPS to the decade. Also coordination, which suggests a mechanism to coordinate ECOP training activities, capacity building and engagement. And lastly, funding, which will provide crucial opportunities to support ECOPS, especially from developing countries, in contributing to and also benefiting from the decade. So we are very grateful for the support that the IOC has given us, and are very much looking forward to continuing our work alongside the IOC and other potential future partners. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this for your words, Evgenia. So let me now present to you the structure of the draft implementation plan. I would like also to emphasize this is a draft. We really need your input. The draft softly speaks about what needs to be done in the decade, very softly hints how this needs to be done, and from outlining what and how needs to be done, we also suggest who has to do what and how. The plan is a strategic framework, and within plan, the initiatives will emerge under the guidance of the plan at all scales: global, regional, national, and local. And we hope that these initiatives will flourish, and the idea will be to ensure alignment of those initiatives towards overall decade vision and mission. Important for the success of the decade are several domains of work, engagement, including data work. So that's why they elaborated a little bit deeper in the plan. Capacity development and transfer of foreign technology. They will need to accompany progress, the cutting edge of research and technological development, but also everyone should be able to benefit from the new ocean science, including island states, landlocked countries, and all developing countries. So the main idea that no one is left behind. The current plan does not contain details of actions, and these actions will be taken and proposed and developed through periodic calls for actions. So expect, please, a call for action. However, it is very important that we ensure that the totality of the actions, as I already have said, takes us from the ocean we have to the ocean we want. Next slide, please. So in the current state of development, I would state that ocean science is largely competent for diagnosing problems. The capacity of science to offer systematic solutions, triggering actions that would be helping to solve issues, many issues of sustainability beyond Sustainable Development Goal 14 for the whole Agenda 2030. This capacity needs a massive upgrade. So we anticipate 2 processes: building science capacity, mobilizing scientists. This is one process. And the second process, we need to create an enabling environment and engage practitioners, decision makers, the private sector, and these 2 processes should fuse under the decade. And by fusing, we will form the end-to-end value chain of delivery for ocean science. And this is exactly the main transformation of ocean science that we need to achieve between 2021 and 2030. And the scale of this transformation is unprecedented. And it's very difficult actually to organize this process, but we hope that we have already some understanding of how this needs to be done. So of course, this will require relying on what exists. So we will have a smooth start, particularly in the current circumstances when we have the world has other priorities that relates to medicine and health. But we hope that with this process, with the engagement of people, what is expecting us is continuous acceleration and broadening of activities and guided by the plan. So we will move towards common targets. And this is exactly what is reflected in the draft vision and mission of the decade. So next slide, please. So what we're trying to create is the science we need for the ocean we want. This was one of the, I think, successful, convincing slogans that resonated with United Nations General Assembly. And the mission for all of us, the mission for the decade, is to generate such science, to produce such science. So the mission is to generate and use the knowledge, and knowledge should be that transformative, leading to that transformative action that I presented to you, from science to action involving practitioners. And the mission should really lead us to the qualities of the ocean that we outlined as societal outcomes. In the mission, we are listing qualities of the ocean: healthy, safe, resilient ocean. We also speak about transparent ocean. So your ideas on the mission, I think, on the formulation of the mission will be also very welcome. So so now let me speak a little bit about the sense of transformation action, and the main idea that the science is needed to the change in the management of the ocean. Right now, the ocean is less managed than is required. But the ocean is not healthy, and after the recovery, and I'm speaking in terms that are very, very resonating with the world right now, after the recovery, the health of the ocean needs to be managed. So what is the science that is needed to manage the ocean? So we believe that this would be the science that is driven by Sustainable Development Agenda.
Yes. So Vladimir, why don't I turn it over to Karen at this point?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think you've made a really good case, and the implementation plan has made a really strong case that this is the best chance we have for harnessing science to get the ocean we want. But it's a big job, and that's why it's going to take 10 years and a global effort. The implementation plan is about how we get this started. So now I'd like to ask Karen Evans to walk us through the framework that'll guide the design and implementation of the science-based actions we're going to take for this decade.
Thank you, Linwood. Good morning, good day, and good evening to everyone. So my name's Karen Evans. I'm a member of the Executive Planning Group, and I'm just going to walk you through the scientific framework that we have drafted together for the implementation plan. And this decade action framework is designed to guide the development of actions that might contribute to the ocean decade. And I'll go through what might comprise an action shortly. It's really framed around 4 high-level objectives, which are listed here, under which sit what we are calling orientations, but they can also be regarded as sub-objectives. So these 4 objectives follow a value chain in that they are interlinked, and they follow a process of generating knowledge that is relevant to society, noting that knowledge generation does not necessarily mean generating new knowledge or collecting new knowledge or new data, but it also might mean generating new sites into already collected data or information. It's also about using that knowledge to develop applications, tools, and services that can then support decision making, with the needs for decision making then contributing to the drivers of that knowledge generation. The first objective really underpins all of the objectives in the framework, and this is the need for increased scientific capacity and capability, which is essential for the ocean decade if it is to achieve a transition from the ocean we currently have to the ocean that we want. We recognise that the priorities and issues that are facing the ocean might change throughout the decade. It is 10 years and things change over time, and that new developments might influence these priorities and issues. So the objectives and their associated orientations will be reviewed and updated throughout the ocean decade to ensure that they respond and adapt to any emerging issues and developments. So I'll go through each of the 4 objectives and their related orientations in more detail and share some examples of the kind of outputs that might occur in relation to each objective. Next slide. So the first objective is to increase transformative ocean knowledge capacity and capability globally. How might we achieve this objective? Some of the things that might be done include improving access to ocean data for all via the development of systems that support fair principles and best practices for ocean data, expanding training, education and ocean literacy, and developing systems that allow us to track progress in developing ocean science capacity and capability. This would allow us at the end of the ocean decade to identify real change and progress in global ocean knowledge capacity and capability. Some of the examples that we might expect of outputs that could be generated as part of this objective include the development of a global data information and knowledge platform for sharing ocean knowledge from knowledge generators through to end users, regional and global training programs for scientists and end users of knowledge, including ocean managers, decision makers and governments, and that these are based on principles and a strategic framework for capacity development. And this framework will be discussed later in the webinar. So this might include, but not be limited to, beneficiaries in small island developing states and least developed countries. It might include initiatives that bring together multiple disciplines to develop new mechanisms for the co-design and co-delivery of ocean science. And it might include tools that build on the processes developed for the IOC's Global Ocean Science Report to track the evolution of ocean science capacity and ocean literacy so that gaps and priorities can be identified and addressed. Next slide. Objective 2 is to expand, innovate and integrate ocean knowledge systems globally. And this objective has a strong emphasis on the use of technology and infrastructure to observe and explore the ocean and generate ocean information. It aims to advance ocean observing systems by integrating the systems we currently have, filling current observation gaps, particularly in areas that are currently poorly observed, and expand the types of observations collected. And in thinking about advancing those observation systems, it will aim to deploy new and innovative technologies to accelerate ocean knowledge discovery. It also aims to innovate and improve services that link knowledge generators to end users and develop tools that recognise and integrate local, traditional and Indigenous observations and knowledge with mainstream scientific observations and knowledge. So in thinking about how we might enhance and expand global observations, some of the outputs that could be generated, for example, could be an integrated system that captures essential physical, chemical, biological, and socio-ecological observations across global to local scales. This might include integrating information on human pressures on the ocean, such as pollution or resource exploitation. Other outputs could include mechanisms and tools for recognising and respectfully using and integrating local, traditional and Indigenous knowledge, and also mechanisms for co-developing approaches to knowledge generation based on observations with those communities. Next slide, please. Objective 3 is focused on understanding and predicting the whole ocean system and its component parts. And this objective is really aimed at improving the understanding of present and future states of the ocean system. And a strong emphasis of actions under this objective will be focused on expanding the understanding and knowledge of ocean processes and ecosystems, human interactions with the ocean, and mechanisms underpinning ocean health. This includes improved detection and forecasting of ocean hazards and destabilizing events that can impact human safety and well-being. Examples of outputs that could be generated as part of this objective include building on current efforts to map the world ocean, to utilise observations produced under Objective 2 to produce what might be considered to be a digital ocean atlas, capable of providing information required to understand societal drivers and multiple pressures on the ocean. Outputs also might include improved modelling and prediction capabilities to deliver relevant and timely societal services, including those required for supporting the implementation of ecosystem-based management strategies, sustainable planning of coastal and ocean activities, and early warning hazard systems. In utilising these modelling and predictive capacity, we might also expect outputs that expand and enhance multi-hazard detection systems. Next slide, please. Our last objective, Objective 4, is focused on developing integrated assessment and decision support systems and other transformational tools and processes. And this objective really brings together the outputs from the previous 3 objectives to develop tools, applications and services to assess and mitigate risks to ocean health, identify sustainable economic opportunities, implement effective and sustainable management strategies for human use of the ocean, and ensure that ocean systems are effectively conserved and where they have been impacted, restored. In doing so, the objective aims to build and enhance the knowledge to end user pathway, and in particular science policy interfaces through the creation of new partnerships and a focus on targeted ocean information products and services. Examples of outputs that could be generated as part of this objective include next generation tools that integrate sector-based activities and provide support for the implementation of holistic management frameworks, such as ecosystem-based management, particularly in data poor and limited capacity regions. It could include tools for understanding the carrying capacity of the ocean, including sustainability thresholds that might inform and support marine spatial planning, coastal zone management, fisheries right-based management, and area-based management. It might include the development of processes and dialogues to strengthen the science policy interface and assist decision makers in accessing, understanding, and utilising ocean knowledge. And it could also include development of innovation clusters that link and exchange emerging technologies, tools, and information. Next slide, please. So how will the actions associated with each of the objectives be carried out? The implementation plan outlines that they will be organised around 4 types of actions: programs, projects, activities, and contributions, with each varying in their scale, organisation of actions and scope of outputs. At the highest level, programs are envisaged to be large-scale, ambitious groupings of a number of projects that might deliver across a number of objectives or orientations within an objective. Projects which may or may not contribute to a program are more discrete actions delivering to an objective or an orientation. Activities might be one-off initiatives or events such as training or outreach campaigns, and might contribute to a project or might be standalone actions such as workshops or conferences. And finally, contributions are resources that are provided or mobilised to implement actions as part of the Ocean Decade. The aim of this hierarchical structure is to provide flexibility for various actions to deliver under the umbrella of the action framework at different scales. Next slide, please. So how might an action be formally recognised as contributing to the Ocean Decade? To facilitate some structure to actions carried out as part of the Ocean Decade, there will be an endorsement process with a series of criteria that each action, whether it be a program, project, activity, or contribution, needs to meet. These include strong alignment with the objectives and orientations of the Ocean Decade, and ultimately the overall goal of the Ocean Decade, which is to move from the ocean we currently have to the ocean that we need. A focus on accelerating the generation of knowledge and understanding of the ocean. A focus on enabling the co-design and uptake of science and ocean knowledge at societal and policy levels for greater impact. And finally, a focus on ensuring that all resulting knowledge generated by the Ocean Decade is provided in an open access, shared and discoverable manner. Actions will be encouraged to involve multi-country and multi-actor partnerships, so involving multiple sectors, multiple disciplines and multiple components of society. Contributions towards capability and capacity development, including but not limited to beneficiaries in small island developing states and least developed countries. They'll be encouraged to involve gender, generational and geographic diversity, and they will be encouraged to involve the recognition and integration of local, traditional and Indigenous sources of knowledge. Once endorsed, actions will be listed on the Decade website and they will be able to use the Decade logo. The governance framework associated with the endorsement process will be presented in the next section of the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And you've given us lots of good examples of the science actions that need to be taken. I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to ask a few questions that have been submitted about the science action plan. One of these questions is, what can the Decade do specifically to make sure that the science that's done results in implementation and action from a sustainable development point of view?
So the Decade is really framed around, as Vladimir pointed out earlier, the 2030 agenda and achieving the goals under the 2030 agenda. We want to transition from the ocean that we currently have, which we know is under incredible stress, to an ocean that we do want and is sustainable into the future. The Ocean Decade will provide the framing for that, but the actual activities, actions, will be carried out by the community, and it is the community that will be really driving whether or not we achieve those objectives. We're just providing the framework here within which those actions can be guided and framed, but it's really up to all of us to get behind the Decade, to ensure that we actually achieve the objectives that the decade is trying to achieve.
Okay. And you mentioned a number of different actions or levels of involvement that can be taken from programs to projects and actions. Who is it that can apply for endorsement? Is it universities? Is it countries? Is it individual scientists?
As I said before, it's the whole of the community that really is needed to get involved with the decade, and so it's all of the above. If I can put it simply, we all need to come together. So as individual scientists, we partner together. As universities, we bring project teams together. We collaborate with other universities, and as nations, we coordinate our scientific outputs and our scientific knowledge generators to come together and put forward actions that might be considered under the decade.
Terrific. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much, Karen. That was very informative. And everyone, please continue adding your questions there. I'll come back at the end and try to take more of the questions that we aren't able to take at this point. Also, if you joined late, the recording of this session and the PowerPoint will be made available to you online and through an email follow-up. Now, we've heard all of the steps of the consultation process throughout, just about how important data and information and knowledge sharing and management are to the success of the decade. And evidence needs to underpin all actions of the decade. And evidence is the foundation of the fit-for-purpose products, services, and applications that need to be delivered to end users. So what I want to do now is just take a few minutes to walk through some of the key principles behind the decade's approach to knowledge and data management. Now, the vision for data, information, and knowledge management for the decade is for us to bring together the entire ocean community to co-design and co-develop a digital representation of the ocean that includes social, economic, and environmental dimensions and variables. And in some senses, you can think of this as a digital twin of the ocean. The Decade Data Management Framework provides a roadmap to link knowledge generators to end users. And the decade will support all stakeholders in accessing and using information products and services tailored to their needs, and that's the important part. We're trying to do this so it meets the needs of people who need to make decisions. End users and knowledge generators will need to work together to define the most relevant forms of knowledge delivery. This is not going to be a top-down process. We need all of you to help us figure out what's the best way of delivering this knowledge. We do know that to achieve this, we need to make sure that we have openly accessible, usable, and responsive digital management tools and a framework. This is a key goal of the decade. This goal, of course, is going to require collective efforts to overcome a number of barriers, including data fragmentation, the siloing of data, the lack of data sharing, and hidden or underexploited data sets, just to name a few of the issues that we have to deal with. Next slide, please. Okay. The coordinated effort required to achieve the decade's aspirations for knowledge sharing will require shared best practices across scales, sectors, and capacities, and will need to innovate and respond to evolving needs while maintaining the operational integrity of data. To build this data management framework, we must build on existing systems and focus on ensuring their interoperability. The decade will embrace and promote timely, free, and open access data, and the use, reuse, and redistribution of the observational data, all for the greatest public good. This is reflected, as you've seen, in the endorsement criteria for those decade actions that Karen talked about. Significant data management capability exists in many places, but not everywhere. And so the focus of the decade will be on coordination and strengthening of capacity to collect and manage and use data in those places where it's weaker. Now, we do have a couple of questions here about data. And one term that comes up quite frequently is the role of data diplomacy. And this is a term that I've heard a couple of times now, including by our frequent collaborator, Pierluigi Buttigieg. Data diplomacy really reflects that this is a global effort, and we are very cognizant of the fact that we have to work with all countries to collect the data we need. And that really is why we're working so closely with the IOC and the IODE, the International Ocean Data and Information Exchange, which works with member countries. So it's a crucial part of the decade approach. It will also include best practices, and someone does ask about best practices and standards for ocean data. Once again, there already is a movement to communicate and share best practices. These best practices will extend beyond data, include all sorts of knowledge and management tools and parts of the decade. There will have to be new best practices that are going to be created, especially if we want to do a much better job of including Indigenous and local knowledge into our global ocean data sets, as well as more social, economic, and human information. Let's see what else we have here for questions about data. How do we know that the data products will be tailor-made? And we won't know at the top. We'll have to know from the bottom up. And so this is where we really need to get decision makers from individuals, fishers, local communities, government officials. Everyone who makes a decision that affects the health of the ocean is going to have to be able to communicate to scientists and to data collecting agencies and data collectors just about what kind of information is needed. And that's going to require a transformation in how scientists and researchers work with stakeholders and decision makers. We don't know how this is going to play out because it will be different for every cultural context, but it is certainly an area that the implementation plan reflects. And we think it's very important to get everyone thinking now about how we're going to do this. Okay. Well, data is a critical pillar, but of course there are other pillars that we have to focus on. And one of those pillars is capacity development. And I've already touched on capacity development just a little bit from the perspective of data management. But I'd like to ask Allison at this point to highlight some of the main elements and principles of the capacity development part of the implementation plan in this framework for the ocean decade. So Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Linwood, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It's great to see so many people on the webinar. So, as Linwood mentioned, I want to talk about capacity development. It is one of the pillars of the enabling environment for that we want to create as part of the decade. It's certainly an issue, I would say, with data that came up again and again in the global consultations and in the regional consultations. So we're very conscious of the importance of getting this right for the decade. Of course, it's not a simple question. To start with, or what influenced our thinking, I guess, is the recognition that ocean science capacity is uneven around the globe. We often talk about geographical inequality, but there's also gender inequality, there's generational inequality. And so really what the decade is aiming to do with capacity development is reversing this asymmetry, trying to build up those areas, those parts of the world, those parts of the generational spectrum of science that are less strong, to have a more equal distribution of capacity and capability in ocean science. Capacity development efforts under the decade will focus on skills, knowledge, and technology to do the science. I think that's very clear, but also on the skills, knowledge, and technology to understand the science and to use it for sustainable development. And that means, obviously, that capacity development efforts are targeting a whole range of actors, from scientists to decision makers to policy makers to private sector who are developing some of the services and the applications to use the science. And so we see capacity development really as a very broad part of the decade that will have a number of different elements. Next slide, please. So the implementation plan for the capacity development elements doesn't aim to set out an exhaustive list of needs nor of actions. We know that the needs and responses are very context specific, and it's going to be the role of the community, the decade stakeholders, all of you, to identify the most appropriate responses to meet the most pressing needs. But the implementation plan does provide a set of principles that we would like to use to guide the development of the most appropriate responses. And you can see those principles listed here. Examples of key principles, or some of those that came out the most strongly in some of the regional consultations and the global consultations, was to make sure that capacity development should be needs driven. It should focus on long-term partnerships and avoid ad hoc fly-in, fly-out efforts that don't have sustainability. And it should consider local and Indigenous knowledge holders both as beneficiaries and providers of capacity development. And you'll see this is a theme that comes up regularly throughout the implementation plan. Next slide, please. So in addition to the principles for capacity development, we've also laid out a proposal for a strategic framework for capacity development. This attempts to provide again, guidance on the types or the range of responses that could be developed to meet the principles that I just mentioned. So it shows that there is a potential for a very diverse range of responses and activities that could be developed as part of the decade that can range from education opportunities, continuous professional development. It can be around physical research infrastructure, so facilitating access to infrastructure or developing mechanisms for shared infrastructure in those regions where there's not enough infrastructure for all countries and all institutions to have the full range of equipment needs. It can be looking at supporting organisations to be leaders in and amplifying research and development. It can touch on public information and communication, and some of these Linwood will come back to in the discussion around decade engagement. One that I do want to particularly mention here is ocean literacy. I think this is a concept that has got a lot of visibility in recent years, and it's beginning to have a lot of traction with national governments and with other stakeholders who are recognising the importance of having broad community understanding of the importance of the ocean. There have been a lot of efforts, including a specific thematic workshop around ocean literacy during the preparation phase of the decade, and we envisage that ocean literacy efforts will continue throughout the implementation of the decade as an essential part of capacity development. And it is intended that the ocean literacy activities will focus on 4 priority areas: advancing policy, so working with governments, decision makers and policymakers; formal education through schools and universities; corporate action, so working with private sector, both within and outside the traditional partners working in the ocean domain; and finally, community engagement. And we look forward in coming months, and I'll come back to this at the end of the webinar, but we look forward in coming months to having further engagement with the broader community about ocean literacy in the context of the decade. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. And we have a number of questions about capacity. One of the questions is, what are the plans of the decade to increase the capacity to use data and knowledge in decision-making? We've talked about having open data and accessible data, but that doesn't mean that everyone's equally capable of using data and knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a fundamental question that brings together these 2 pillars of the enabling environment. And I think there are different ways of looking at this, and we've been starting to have a lot of discussions around this question. I think there are different levels. So there's, first of all, making sure that we have a very deliberate strategy to target the current gaps. So in some countries, that is purely providing the infrastructure and the skills to be able to access existing data sets. And that may be at the level of ocean scientists, it may be at the level of scientists sitting within government or within private sector. We also then need to recognise that there are other levels, such as policymakers, decision makers, perhaps some in civil society, the media and so on, that don't need that same level of capacity to access and use raw data sets and sources. And that's where we want to use the knowledge and management framework to be looking at different ways of having applications and services that pre-analyze, pre-package key pieces of data and transform that into a service or an application that can be used by actors at different levels. So we're really working with the community to get a sense of where those gaps are and what the needs are, so that we can have a very needs-driven and response that operates at different levels.
Okay, thanks. We have one question that asks about plans for capacity to help scientists better communicate their science, and two questions that ask, what is the implementation plan saying in terms of how we're going to get scientists to listen better to the needs of decision makers?
Yeah, thank you, Linwood. These are great questions. And I think, the way we've been envisaging some of this has been looking at a push and a pull. So traditionally, there's a push from scientists to do the science and get the science out there. What we're trying to work on through the decade as well is also build up the pull. So build up the pull from decision makers, from policy makers, from end users more broadly, so that push and pull between the scientists and between the end users is much stronger, and that there's a stronger link and communication cycle between those two bodies. Now, that's the theory. How does that work? That works by creating forums and platforms and occasions for those two groups to meet. And it also, as the question asker has very rightly said, works by building the capacity of those two types of groups to understand how the other communicates and how the other responds and absorbs information. And there will need to be capacity development efforts around that. And you'll see in the implementation plan that we definitely talk about building the capacity of end users to be able to communicate with scientists and absorb the information. I think we also need to really highlight that we also need to be working on the other end of that spectrum with the scientists to be communicating their science and to be able to listen and absorb the need of the end users.
Great. And then sort of one final question here is, how will countries and communities determine what their capacity needs are and then convey that to the rest of the world to ask for help in building those capacities?
Yeah, another excellent question. So we currently have a global process through the Global Ocean Science Report, which looks at a broad international overview or analysis of major ocean science capacity development needs. And one of the things that has been identified through that process is the need for national level ocean science capacity development plans. And that's something we certainly see as a potential action through the decade, is providing support to governments, providing a methodology to governments, perhaps building on some of the experiences with the analysis and work done in the Global Ocean Science Report to develop national level ocean science capacity development plans that could be then used as a way of interacting with partners who potentially have resources to support priority needs.
Terrific. We have a number of other questions, but we'll come back to those later in the session so we can move on and stay on time. So thanks, Alison. Now, the need to work together and to involve a wide range of stakeholders to achieve this real change that we need has been raised several times already since the beginning of this session. For the next part of the presentation, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the engagement process that the decade will follow, particularly in the early stages of that. Now, it's important, as this slide says, that it's everyone's decade. It's not the IOC's decade, it's not the EPG's decade, it's not even the UN's decade, it's all of our decades. The importance of working collectively cannot be understated in this decade. And if you were in Copenhagen, you might have heard me say in the first global planning meeting that the decade is a movement, and it's your decade. So it requires participation from everyone. Foremost, the decade will be implemented for and by an incredibly diverse range of stakeholders. And it's important to identify those stakeholders who are not currently at the table and get them involved, and then to keep their engagement throughout the process. Engagement is required throughout the value chain for the co-design and co-delivery of ocean science, and Alison talked, I think, about that very eloquently. Engagement is needed for efficient knowledge sharing. Engagement is needed to develop these fit-for-purpose products, services, and applications, so the information is really used in decision-making. And engagement is needed to foster and stimulate innovation across all actors, disciplines, and at all levels. There are a number of key stakeholder groups that have been identified throughout the preparation process. There will be more as we get this decade rolling. And the boundaries between these stakeholder groups are fluid. And this fluidity emphasizes the need to have a flexible and broad approach to engagement with multiple entry points and multiple interests. Many of us, including I'm sure many of you that are listening in today, will find ourselves in more than one stakeholder group. So it's important that we don't let ourselves become siloed in any one stakeholder group. Next slide, please. Convening and supporting diverse groups of stakeholders to co-design and co-deliver transformative science is a key priority of the decade mission, and this implementation plan reflects that. To achieve this, the decade will need to generate the right conditions for collaboration, these enabling conditions. Mechanisms such as a global stakeholder forum and an international conference series will focus on bringing together end users and knowledge generators. And these kinds of series and fora may have to be different than we even envisioned a month ago, and we're very aware of that. Of course, there will be periodic calls for action, calls for programs and projects, and the first version of that will be initiated later this year. Institutions and groups of stakeholders that are committed to aligning their efforts with the vision and mission of the decade will be able to register as decade implementing partners or as decade stakeholder forums. They'll be able to engage in the Global Stakeholder Forum as a means of establishing new partnerships and collaborating around decade actions. And the whole idea here is to create a network of networks to get as many stakeholders involved in talking to each other as possible to create new and creative solutions. A number of mechanisms will stimulate engagement at national levels in support of the co-design and co-delivery of actions. And this includes the creation of national coordination committees. It's a global effort, but it requires national and local action and innovation. There will also be a Decade Alliance, and this will be launched to catalyze large-scale commitments and stimulate networking, resource mobilization, and influence. Alliance members, both institutional and individual, will lead by example and will be asked to motivate actions by other stakeholders. There'll be more about that alliance later in the webinar. Now, at the outset, we need to encourage all stakeholders, not just the usual suspects, to become advocates of the decade, to communicate about the decade, and to inspire action. We need this to be a real movement, and we need funders to step up. We need influencers to step up. We need important people to step up and support the decade and create the momentum we need to keep this effort going through the next decade. To launch this movement, a communication strategy is being developed with a clear focus on outreach and branding, and it's based around the theme of Generation Ocean, or Gen O, which is designed to spur all generations and everyone who has a stake in the ocean, and really that is everyone on the planet, to work together to use the best available science and knowledge to deliver the ocean we need for the future we want. So that's the sort of how the implementation plan is thinking about getting the decade going, but it'll be an evolving process and it will need to be tailored to the diversity of stakeholders that we have working with us and the people we need to get on board. And let me just look here and see what kinds of questions we have. And one question goes straight to that, which is how are we going to engage and communicate with Indigenous communities? And really that is, there's no one single answer, one size fits all to that. We are thinking at this point about identifying regional nodes to start tailoring the communications plan, the Generation Ocean approach to different regional cultures and regional ways of communicating. But then within each of those regions, there will be national approaches. Every country communicates differently, and then stakeholders within each country communicate differently. And that gets all the way down to the level of Indigenous peoples. So, with everything that we've talked about here in this implementation plan, the idea is to get the ball rolling, but really it's up to all of us to figure out how to do this. So we want you all to be ambassadors in the communication project. Let's see here. One question points out that academics and researchers, and in particular social scientists, are not mentioned as stakeholders. In the presentation, we may not have called them out in particular, but the implementation plan makes very clear that all sciences and all forms of scholarship, we think, have something to contribute to the science of the UN Ocean Decade. And that, of course, academics are important stakeholders, as are engineers, as are community leaders, as are individual people. So really, it would be impossible to enumerate all of the stakeholders that are going to be required to make this decade happen. And that really is a core principle of this communication approach, is that everyone has a role to play, both in collecting ocean science and in using ocean science to make informed decisions, whether it's about where your food comes from, or where you decide to take your vacation, or how you're going to manage the resources that are in your neighborhood or community. It's a broad and diverse group that we need to include. And one question is, how do we define stakeholders? I think I just defined it rather broadly, but anybody who cares about the ocean, who depends on the ocean, and as I mentioned earlier, we think that really is everyone on the planet. This is not a top-down process. This is a bottom-up process. And so we want to engage everyone and catalyze action. So the solutions come from the bottom, and part of the role of the decade is to support those actions, to share information across actions, and to make sure that we're getting the most out of the transformation that we think will happen over the next decade. Okay. Well, of course, I'm going to move on now. Of course, this is all a big project, and we've heard now about science and capacity building and communications and data sharing. But all of this needs to be organized at some level. It needs to be orchestrated, and we need to monitor what we're doing and the progress we're making so that we know that we're achieving the objectives of the decade. And towards this end, I would like to invite Alison back to present to us the approach to governance, coordination, and monitoring of the decade.
Thank you, Linwood. So as Linwood said, we're sort of moving into the nuts and bolts now of how this could all happen. So if you remember from one of Vladimir's early slides about the structure of the implementation plan, this is really part 3 of the document. So starting with governance, as a reminder, the decade is a UN-wide initiative that was endorsed by the UN General Assembly. So there's obviously this governance structure also tries to show how the decade will be implemented within the overall UN system. You will see that the governing bodies of the IOC will provide intergovernmental oversight of the decade and will report to UNESCO and the UN General Assembly via established existing processes. But you'll see in the middle of this slide what we're calling a decade board. This is a new entity that will be created, we hope, during the first part of 2021, which is the board that will exist over the life of the decade to provide high-level strategic oversight of the decade. And it will take over some of the functions of the existing executive planning group, which itself will be disbanded at the end of this year with the end of the preparation phase. The board will have up to 20 members. This will include representatives of UN agencies and other relevant experts, and they'll be acting on 2-year terms. And it will be established through a call for nominations, which will respect diversity around very clear criteria that will be established to make sure we get good gender, generational, and geographic diversity and representation on the board. Importantly, the board will decide on the endorsement of the programs. So if you remember from the slide from Karen, we had the hierarchy of decade actions with the programs, the projects, the activities, and the contributions. The programs which are the highest level, endorsement of those as people respond to calls for action will be done at the board level. And if you want more information about the board, I would refer you to the annex of the implementation plan, where we actually have a draft terms of reference for that board, which provides a little bit more detail about how we envisage that will function. Next slide, please. So in terms of coordination, the main organ or the main entity for coordination is the Decade Coordination Unit, which I think you saw on the previous slide sits out to the side of the board because it provides secretariat functions to the board. So this Decade Coordination Unit, again, it's a new unit that will be created early in 2021, which we envisage will sit within the existing IOC Secretariat in Paris, will play a central coordination role during the implementation of the decade. It's planned that this will be a UN interagency secretariat, as the decade is a UN-wide initiative, as we've already mentioned, and which is something which is very, very important to remember. The Decade Coordination Unit has three main functions. So the primary coordination office, as I mentioned, for the implementation, which means that it will carry out endorsements of projects, activities, and contributions. So the programs will be endorsed at the board level, projects and activities and contributions will be endorsed at the coordination unit level. It will coordinate monitoring and reporting, and we'll come back to that. It will importantly establish an overview of priority resource needs for decade actions and match those to commitments from different partners. And it will provide a point of liaison or a platform for liaison between stakeholders and the board. It then also, as I mentioned, acts as the Secretariat for the Decade Board and the Secretariat for the Ocean Decade Alliance. Sitting underneath the Decade Coordination Unit, there are a range of decentralized coordination structures. We don't know how many of these will be needed, where they'll be located, or what they'll particularly be focused on, because that will come through the generation of ideas for programs and different initiatives under the decade. What we're envisaging either at the programmatic level or at a regional ocean basin level, that there could be different types of decentralized coordination centers or structures, to make sure that there's a very strong link between activities happening on the ground and the decade coordination. We're looking at two different types of decentralized coordination structures that could be newly established in addition to the use of existing structures. So these new types are program or regional coordination offices. These would be more formal offices that would be hosted by member states as IOC UNESCO offices within the country. Secondly, we'd be looking at the possibility for international organizations or research institutes or groups of governments to have program or regional collaborative centers, which would be similar to the coordination offices in terms of their function and their role, but which would not be formal IOC UNESCO offices. Regardless of whether they're new or existing, whether they're offices or collaboration centers, decentralized structures have the overall role of providing an interface between projects and activities at the national and regional level and the Decade Coordination Unit. And they would also be involved in the endorsement process of decade actions relevant to their mandate. So if it's at the programmatic level. Next slide, please. So moving on now to resource mobilization. How are we going to pay for all this? And this is, certainly in the first webinar, this was a question that came up a number of times. So I think it's worthwhile just establishing some common some thoughts and principles about resource mobilization. For a start, the decade is not a financing facility. Again, for resource mobilization, as for the other issues, it provides a framework within which we aim to inspire action, to inspire contributions, and to inspire commitments. So decade actions, which are identified through calls for actions and which proponents, such as yourselves, can submit, will come in. Some of these will already be funded. They will have funding attached to them, and some of them won't be funded, and they'll need a framework within which they can be supported to find the funding and the resources that they need for implementation. The resource base for the decade will need to be broad and flexible. No single agency or actor will mobilise or manage all the decade resources. Support will be needed at a number of different levels and for different types of cost. So there'll be the cost for the implementation of programs, projects and activities, where we refer to these in the implementation plan as action costs, and we'll also need to cover the coordination costs of the governance and coordination structure that we just saw. We expect that resources for the decade will be both financial and in-kind resources, and I think we can't underestimate the importance of these in-kind resources, which could include things like access to research infrastructure, time on research vessels, access to data sets that are held by private sector. These sorts of elements which are incredibly important for ocean science and which are provided in the form of in-kind support. If you look at the figure on the right-hand side of the slide, we highlight here 4 different financing mechanisms which may exist for the decade. Again, these are explained in more detail in the implementation plan, but going through them quickly, the first top left-hand corner, direct support to the decade for actions or for coordination costs. This is typically using existing processes, whether it be through member states to the UN, whether it be through philanthropic foundations and their existing grant making, whether it be through national research agencies, but we're looking at those types of bodies that are also already supporting ocean science to support decade endorsed actions. We mentioned the Ocean Decade Alliance, or Linwood mentioned that previously. This alliance will be a key component of resource mobilisation efforts for the decade. It will focus on significant and voluntary resource commitments. The idea is that it's essentially, it's not a pool of money, but it is a platform to connect large-scale resource providers to proponents of decade actions that need support. And this is where the Decade Coordination Unit, in its role as the Alliance Secretariat, has a very strong and an important role to play as a matchmaking service between commitments that are put into the Decade Alliance, or virtually put into the Decade Alliance, and the needs of actions, that decade actions that have been proposed and endorsed. And then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the fourth financing mechanism which we're exploring, which is we've had interest from some parties to develop third-party financing and grant-making facilities. These would be foundations or NGOs or governments who want themselves to mobilise resources and provide support to decade actions and want to be recognised within the decade framework for doing that. So that's a potential for another way that groups who are already making grants, rather than just supporting individual actions, could actually have a more structured and systematic approach to being a decade partner. And again, there are more details about that in the implementation plan. Next slide, please. So just to finish up then this part of the presentation, measuring progress. This is incredibly important. We need to understand progress and impact. Obviously, I think it's evident this is important for a number of reasons, both to see the return on investment and the impact that we're having, but also throughout the decade to be able to revisit, redefine priorities, and make sure that we're continuing on the right track over the 10-year period, which is a very long period. So the idea is to have a set of high-level operational, financial, and scientific indicators, which would be validated by the board once it was in place. All proponents of decade actions would need to provide brief annual reporting around these operational, financial and scientific indicators. And then the decentralized coordination structures, the Decade Coordination Unit, would consolidate that and provide ongoing progress reporting of how the decade is tracking against those indicators. In the table on the right-hand side, there are a number of other reports and analyses that we plan to do as well. For example, to have every 2 years a review and update of the scientific objectives and orientations in the Decade Action Framework to make sure that emerging issues are being taken into account, and that as boxes get ticked off, that there are new orientations or objectives that are brought into that framework. We're looking at having a midterm review of the entire decade, 5 years into its implementation, and re-looking at that point at the entire implementation plan. Are the engagement mechanisms working? Are the communications working? How can we refine and adapt them? And then, of course, a series of annual progress reports or biennial state of the decade reports, which are a more comprehensive look at the impacts of the decade that we envisage developing as part of the decade implementation. And I think I'll leave it there and pass back to you, Linwood. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm going to pose a few questions to you, Alison, because we have questions coming in. One question is about the formation of the national coordination committees. Will they be created anew? Will these be created from scratch, or will these be simply recycling existing national committees or national IOC committees? And if these are going to be really built on existing committees, how will we make sure that the national coordinating committees adhere to the important and ambitious goals for diversity in all the senses that Vladimir talked about?
An excellent question. So these could be they could either be new committees that are developed, or they could be existing committees that are expanded or strengthened, because we know many countries do have committees. Some of them may need some refocusing or strengthening to really be able to fulfill this role. It is key that they are multi-stakeholder, multi-actor, that they represent diversity, and that they are capable of fulfilling roles around national coordination, around national communication and outreach, that they can be the sort of the conduit from the decade board and the decade coordination unit to the national researcher community. As we move through this process, there will be further additional guidance provided on what those committees could look like and what the process is for having them endorsed, if you like, as national coordination committees. And I envisage that the criteria that will be used in that process will be very similar to the endorsement criteria that you saw for the decade actions, which very much put diversity as an important point. So it's something that the coordination unit would be looking at before signing off on the endorsement of one of these coordination committees as a decade endorsed entity.
Okay. There are a couple of questions that just are asking for a little bit more clarity on what really is the difference in terms of content between the annual progress reports and the biennial state of the decade report.
Yeah, good question. So the annual progress report is more, I would say, a sort of, in my mind anyway, sort of a typical 15 to 20 page, here are the indicators, here's how we've tracked against them, here are some success stories, but a brief snapshot of annual progress in terms of the number of programs, the number of projects, the diversity of PIs involved in those, the number of beneficiaries in capacity development, how much money was raised, how much money needs to be raised, those sorts of issues. The biennial state of the decade report will go in much more detail into an analysis of the impacts of the decade against the decade outcomes. So looking much further at with a stronger focus on the scientific impact, but really taking the decade outcomes as a starting point and trying to track how we are working to achieve those outcomes. So a much more analytical report.
Okay, and a bit of a follow-up to that, there's a question about the IP doesn't mention, the implementation plan doesn't mention specifically if the decade will take a formal role in trying to synthesize knowledge and learnings and best practices as the decade rolls out. How is that being addressed in your thinking?
I don't think the decade can entirely cover that, or at least through the coordination and monitoring and this part around measuring progress. I think that there's certainly initiatives or actions that are focused on synthesizing knowledge and reporting on knowledge would be very welcome. There are also other UN processes that are very important. So the World Ocean Assessment, the Global Ocean Science Report, and the decade would certainly be feeding into those processes. I think they are established UN processes where you do have that capacity and that capability to synthesize a lot of that knowledge. And then the decade will focus more on a series of high-level scientific indicators. These will be at the level of the objectives for the decade. So there will be some consolidation and synthesis of knowledge around the objectives of the decade, but people will need to really have that overview of the decade reporting on scientific objectives, the World Ocean Assessment, Global Ocean Science Report as UN processes, and then other actions or initiatives that may come up to complement that and to report on consolidated knowledge.
And are there any plans towards the end of the decade to make sure that the momentum continues and the transformation results into long-lasting change? What's the handoff?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a need for an exit strategy, to use a terrible phrase, for the decade, and this is something that at the time of something where we're starting to discuss already. But I think particularly that point of the midterm review is where reflections about that issue and the legacy of the decade will really take more emphasis and more strength. So through the second part of the decade, really looking to what that legacy building is, that can then be starting to refocus perhaps, or bring in new actions or new priorities to put the pieces in place for that legacy building. There is then obviously a final review and a final report that can document some of that, but the thinking and the infrastructure and the environment to make that happen needs to start earlier, and the midterm review is a logical place to really have the green light for starting that in a more systematic fashion. But we should be thinking about it throughout the decade, because it's 2030 and beyond. It's certainly something that we would encourage everybody to be thinking about as they're developing actions and ideas to be implemented throughout the decade.
Okay, and you're very clear, I think, about the fact that the decade itself is not a funding body, but it is almost like a matchmaker in a sense, in trying to bring to the attention of funders needs around the world for doing a better job of making ocean science a part of decision making. How does the decade envision both making sure that countries with limited capacity are represented in that decision making about endorsement, and also how can these countries make sure that their needs are heard if they have limited capacity to participate in fora and things like that?
Yeah, I think in terms of the formal governance and coordination structures, there are certainly criteria for geographical diversity built into those structures, which means that decision making around endorsement of programs, projects, activities, and contributions is certainly something that there'll be diversity in that decision making by the board and the coordination structures. I think this idea that actions can be put forward without necessarily having all the secured funding, and that then the coordination unit plays a role in matchmaking, is a key thing for countries that don't necessarily have the same resources. And one of the key roles of the coordination unit, as well as the decentralized coordination structures and the board at its level, is to be making those connections between the fantastic ideas that are coming from countries or organizations based in countries with fewer resources, and those countries that are looking to support actions in outside their national boundaries. And we've certainly started that process already, engaging with a large group of philanthropic foundations that want to engage in the decade, but have said to us, we don't really know where the entry point is yet. So there are initiatives underway to start those sort of discussions. In saying that, however, I think it's important to point out that the coordination unit and the board can't do everything in terms of resource mobilization. And this comes back to the point I think, Linwood, you made about everybody that wants to support the decade being an advocate for the decade and using their networks and their connections and professional expertise to also be thinking about resource mobilization and so on. The decade is too big for just the coordination unit and the board to be doing all the awareness raising about resource mobilization, although it will play that central role in trying to make links between priority actions and resources that are available.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to hold governance questions now because I want to give you a chance to move on to the next part, which is going to explain sort of what are the next steps in the process. And then we'll have about 30 minutes to go over questions that remain in my questions box.
Great. So we've just got two more slides to wrap up before we get to that question session. So the first one is really what's next. I do want to highlight here some key milestones and some dates, but we also recognise everybody and the IOC as much as anybody that we're in a very unique period of time, and that what we present here may change, may adapt. We need to be very reactive to the current situation. So I would say this slide is our best guess of what's going to roll out, but again, we encourage you all to register on the Decade website so that as things change and evolve, you can have the latest information. But essentially here, some of the key milestones that need to happen or that are planned currently to happen before the end of the year and before the formal start of the decade, 1st of January 2021. First of all, the comment period and the review of the implementation plan. It's still very much a zero draft. We imagine there'll be a couple more iterations before we get to a final document. But Lynn will explain to you how you can provide feedback in addition to the questions that are coming through to the implementation plan. There's also another regional workshop, as Vladimir mentioned. There have been a number of regional workshops that have already been held, and there'll be one more held at the end of this month for the Western Tropical Atlantic Ocean Basin. We then move to a final implementation and summary report around European summertime this year. There will also be a regional synthesis report at that time, which will really try to capture the very rich discussions that occurred in the regional workshops, where we had a total of over 1,000 participants, and even more now that we've got the additional workshop in late April. That final implementation plan, as well as a summary report, which will be in a much easier to read and shorter version of the implementation plan, something like a summary for policymakers, for those who are familiar with other UN type documents, will need to be endorsed and approved by the IOC governing bodies before being presented to the UN General Assembly, which currently is planned for the European autumn of this year, around September, October. And we'll be following that obviously very closely in terms of any changes to those timing. The decade then begins January 2021, and we're already starting to, or very engaged in planning of both an international kickoff event in Germany in May next year, and starting to think about regional kickoff events. For example, an event that is being looked at in Cairo in February next year for Africa. We also have a number of other elements which are going to happen over the course of this year. Many of these were planned around the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon, which I think you all know has been postponed with a new date not yet announced. So we're now re-looking at the strategy. So I don't have definitive answers on when these things are going to happen, but we do anticipate that they will commence in the second half of this year after the endorsement of the implementation plan by the IOC governing bodies. That includes launching of the Ocean Decade Alliance to really get some visibility and create some buzz and excitement around that alliance, and thus increase membership and resource commitments. As we've mentioned a couple of times on this webinar, also a decade call for action. Just to be very clear on this, there will be numerous decade calls for action throughout the decade. They will be staggered so as not to overwhelm the board and the Decade Coordination Unit with submissions. At this point, we're thinking of starting at the programmatic level and then eventually moving into project calls for actions, or to thematic or ocean basin focused calls for action. We hope to have the first call for action come out in the second half of this year, and that's something to please really keep an eye on the Decade website, although we will be communicating through other channels as well. We're looking at the potential for other regional launches, for other ocean basins or regions who want to do something specific to celebrate the beginning of the decade, and also use this sort of launch event as a platform for looking at regional priorities and plans and building on the work of some of the regional workshops. And then we also have, as Linwood alluded to, an idea for a series of virtual sessions over the rest of the year to allow us to explore certain elements of the decade in more detail. So next slide, please, and we can talk about those in a little bit more detail. So as you know, or as you've seen now, I think as we touch on the end of the presentation, the webinars, the one yesterday and today, have really only touched on the surface of the implementation plan. There's a lot more detail in the document, and I can see just from the questions that I'm seeing come up that there's a lot of interest in going into detail around some of those things. Because of the cancellation of the second global planning meeting, we know that this session doesn't give you that networking and capacity to make connections that we would have had in a face-to-face meeting. We're not going to be able to replace that entirely by virtual sessions, but we would like to capture some of that, and have a series of webinars that are probably smaller than this, or that will depend on the interest, I guess, but that really allow groups to delve into detail on certain components of the implementation plan, or on certain themes related that are important for the decade. So here you'll see some ideas and some suggestions that we've already had. So having webinars around the science actions, around capacity development, around data, or looking at having an ocean literacy summit that is linked to the decade, looking at the role of the private sector, looking at the integration of social and natural sciences. So these are some ideas. Again, the idea being that they can both allow a much more detailed exploration and discussion of some of what is being proposed, as well as further into the year, allowing synergizing partnership development, collaborations, starting to get thinking going about actions and initiatives that could be proposed in response to calls for action. So we're working very hard with the EPG to come up with ideas and develop a calendar for these, and certainly in the feedback to this webinar, we'd be extremely interested to have your ideas on issues that you would like to see explored in more detail, or indeed if you would like to be involved in organising or participating in the organisation of some of these issue-based webinars. So again, please, if you haven't already, look at the Decade website, oceandecade.org, and sign up, because that puts you on a distribution list that you can then, you'll get mail outs about different activities and dates that are happening, and particularly important, as I say, given that plans are changing rapidly at the moment, given the current global situation.
Okay. And Alison, I'm getting some questions now. How many people did we expect at the in-person global planning meeting, and how does that compare to how many people we've been able to engage virtually?
So we had 450 registered for the global planning meeting, although I think the interest actually may have been a little bit higher than that, and we were somewhat limited in terms of space. So we were going to limit the global planning meeting to 450 people. Just doing a very quick calculation, if my maths holds out, for the two webinars combined, we've had about 560 people involved in these webinars. So we've been able to actually reach more people with these webinars than we would have with the in-person, or that would have been able to attend the global planning meeting in person.
Good. Thanks for that. And with many fewer travel costs, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Another question here is about once again, sort of the way that programs and actions will be defined and created. The question really says, do proposals for programs and actions and projects have to respond to specific calls and objectives and specific calls, or can these actions and programs and projects be proposed de novo with ideas that maybe we haven't even considered in the implementation plan, or that won't, that will be totally new as the decade unrolls?
Okay, so I think there are a number of issues there. First of all, you saw in the hierarchy that Karen presented, there are 4 types of action. So we have programs and projects, and I'll come back to those, and we have activities and contributions. So activities are these one-off sort of standalone type events, and contributions are resource commitments. For activities and contributions, there won't be any calls for actions, or I should say there's an open call for actions that will start later in the year. And in fact, we imagine that will be a simpler process to get activities and contributions looked at on a rolling basis, because these are things that come up that people would like to see endorsed, and we need to be fairly reactive to those. With programs and projects, the idea is to really collect them through calls for actions. And the idea of having the decade action framework that Karen presented is to provide some structure to the responses. Again, that framework, which is the first and probably the most important endorsement criteria, is that the action responds and contributes to that framework. We have deliberately not made that overly prescriptive. We have deliberately not made that something that is very strict in terms of what can and cannot be proposed, and we believe that gives scope for a wide range of programs and projects to be proposed, including emerging issues that fit within those 4 broad objectives and the associated strategic orientations.
Okay. Yep. There were a number of regional workshops, including a Southern Ocean workshop that was held in February, and then an Arctic regional workshop that I believe is scheduled for the near future. How were the findings and outcomes of these regional workshops incorporated into the implementation plan, or will they be incorporated? How will they be incorporated going forward?
They have definitely been incorporated into the implementation plan in numerous different sections. So certainly they influenced the framing of the objectives, the strategic orientations, and the text on the expected outputs and benefits. They very strongly influenced the data management principles and the capacity development principles. They influenced the ways in which we're proposing engagement through the decade, and they also informed thinking about, more the nuts and bolts again, about resources and different processes and so on. So while you don't see in the implementation plan or in the main text anyway, specific reference to ideas or issues from individual workshops, they have certainly the outcomes have been very carefully studied by both the Secretariat and indeed the Executive Planning Group to make sure that the key messages have influenced the way the proposals are put together. In the annex to the implementation plan, there is a snapshot of some of the key outcomes and discussions from the workshops based around the different outcomes, and what we're proposing to do to give more visibility to the outcomes of those workshops is to prepare a regional synthesis report, or it may not be called that, but that's our working title at the moment, to really capture both regional characteristics and details and specific outputs, but also some of the common themes that came out throughout these workshops. And we hope that will inspire action in different ocean basins and amongst different stakeholder groups moving forward, because I know there are certain areas where, following the regional workshop, there's actually been a committee or a task group put in place to develop regional plans and priorities. And so, yes, there are individual workshop reports, but we also want to have a sort of a summary report or a synthesis report that can inform that process moving forward. The regional planning meetings were just the start of a process, and we want to be able to give people enough information to be able to use those as a springboard to continue the discussions at a regional or ocean basin level.
Sure, good. I want to open it up now to all of our panelists, and we have quite a few questions. And I think this first question I'm going to ask is really one that first I'd like Yevgenia to try to tackle, and then maybe Vladimir can follow up. And so it's about the ECOPs. It is first trying to understand how to join the ECOP and what will be the processes for making sure that there's information sharing across the ECOP network. And then the second is, will there be any formal recognition of this ECOP, or will it remain an informal working group?
Yeah, thank you for this very important questions. So in terms of information sharing, we are now in the process of really organizing our informal working group and organizing the whole process with working with all the other ECOPs around the world, which are not, part of the informal working group as of yet, but we are trying to expand this network, of course. And the informal working group will cease to exist at the end of this year. So our plan is to organize our activities so that it all continues with the beginning of the decade in January 2021. So in terms of sharing, we are one of our plans or one of our projects is to create this network of networks. So we are going to obviously share the information about the activities and the ways how ECOPs can help the decade, can contribute to the decade through those networks. So this is one thing. And then we will also use the surveys throughout the decade, to monitor the progress of the decade in terms of different geographical locations and gender and generations. And we will constantly monitor the progress and get the feedback from the ECOPs from all over the world. And obviously, we are also trying to participate in ocean-related conferences, once they are again will take place in real life. And we are planning to run maybe some seminars or workshops, side events at those big conferences to spread the word about the ECOPs and how they can contribute to the decade. So yeah, I guess this is the answer to the first question. And as to the formal recognition, well, I'm not sure if in terms of if we issue some kind of a certificate or not. I guess not, but we will welcome all in early career ocean professionals from all over the world to contribute to the decade and to its activities, and really work on the priorities that I've talked earlier in my intervention, So everybody is welcome to join the activities of the ECOPS.
Okay. Vladimir, do you have anything to say about that, or has Evgenia covered it?
Yeah, Evgeny covered it mostly. Thank you very much, Lynn. What my impression is that what is important in this sense is that because early career ocean professionals are the future of the decade, that there must be strong communication between the decade board and the ECOPS. So we have their input and their views on this, and we already started to invite early career professionals to the meetings of the executive planning group, and this practice will continue. Thank you.
Thank you. And while I have you off of mute, Vladimir, we've been asked about how exactly the decade coordinating body will coordinate with other global processes like the COPs, the IPCC, the Convention on Biodiversity, and the upcoming decade of restoration.
It's a difficult and a good question, and there are many good questions here. So, I would like to refer to you, actually, Linwood, when you call the decade the movement. So I think we already created the platform for activities. And, the second thing that we really need to achieve is to convince the community that the plan that we're going to propose is the strategy is the way forward towards managed ocean. So we have to develop the vision for the ocean, and then all the elements will be contributing to this through the World Ocean Assessment, IPCC assessment. So by increasing the scale of activities in the ocean, by mainstreaming ocean science, I think we are going to achieve the target. Also a reflection on the role of social scientists. There is always kind of a push from certain circles to say we need more social science. Actually, the whole organization of the decade is a manifestation of the social science, because what we are dealing with now is not really ocean observations in salinity and temperature. We are trying to create a movement, and this is exactly social science that involves elements of economy, elements of psychology, elements of education. This is a social movement as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And that was a question I was going to ask for Karen as well. Is how do these scientists who have not normally participated in these kinds of processes with the IOC, for instance, how do we get the scientists that are not well represented currently to participate and to really take ownership of these objectives?
Thanks, Linwood. So I think Alison really did touch on this quite succinctly, in that the decade will provide the matchmaking process and the matchmaking framework that will reach out and engage across disciplines and sectors and bring those together, either through some of the more dedicated webinars that were mentioned, but also through activities during the decade, so starting from 2021, to bring all of those actors together to start that process of engaging across sectors and between disciplines, and starting that real collaboration process that will bring those that perhaps don't have the opportunity, particularly in capacity limited areas, that don't have the opportunity to get together with others, but also those that traditionally haven't come together as well. So we're thinking about the framework that allows those societal actors come together, start a conversation, generate those collaborations, and really start thinking about the kinds of activities that move beyond business as normal.
Great.
Thank you.
And another question, I think that also is for you, Karen, is one of the participants points out that what we know about the ocean and what conditions are most important for the well-being of people, hopefully will change as we learn more, and hopefully, I mean, we'll make new discoveries, what is the plan for us to reevaluate scientific objectives or the direction we think the decade should be going as we make these discoveries?
Yeah, and so Alison again really outlined that review and evaluation process that is being built into the decade, keeping in mind that this is a draft at the moment, and if we need to build in more evaluation points or more mechanisms that will enable us to be nimble and adaptive and flexible as discoveries are made, as new issues or emerging issues come online, that we can adapt the objectives that we're currently proposing so that they capture those new issues, the emerging issues, and they also take into account the new discoveries that are coming online throughout the decade. There is no doubt that the decade will need to adapt and be flexible. It's 10 years. And if we think about the kind of discoveries that have happened over the last 10 years and think about the discoveries that might occur over the next 10 years, then there is a real need to ensure that the decade can pivot and adapt to those new discoveries and those emerging issues. And so we have put in place a number of mechanisms where we can reflect back, but we can also look forward and shift the priorities of the decade in accordance.
Good, and along similar lines, Alison, the people who have been involved in the global planning processes and the regional meetings now, the stakeholders, from the perspective of age, gender, geographical diversity, and even scientific discipline, probably aren't as diverse as we hope they will be over the course of the decade. How are we going to update governance to make sure that it reflects the growing diversity of people involved in the decade?
Yeah, yes, good question. Sorry. The main sort of the formal governance structure being the board, again, has diversity criteria built into the nomination process, and the terms for that board are 2 years. So throughout the decade, you'll get a turnover of members on the board, which means that you'll be able to continue to increase and build on that diversity. I think it links back as well to making sure that the message is getting out as broadly as possible. And this is why we've started, and we will continue, and we count on all of you as well as advocates and spokespeople for the decade to tap into different groups and to move outside our sort of comfort zones, to be talking to different actors and groups with different levels of diversity, so that they are aware of and interested in participating not only in the governance structures, because there is one board and one decade coordination unit, but there are also all the other stakeholder engagement mechanisms that you went through, Linwood, where we're talking about decade implementing partners or decade stakeholder platforms, which also need to be incredibly diverse and rich. But the first step is raising awareness and making sure people are aware. Secondly, that they're excited, and thirdly, that they're motivated to engage. And yes, we are working very hard to do that. The EPG members were selected in part because of their great networks and their capability to spread the word. The Ocean Decade Alliance members will do the same, but we count on everybody in the community who wants to be a supporter of the decade to also be advocating for and raising the awareness and generating the excitement, so that we have a pool of people to choose from to increase the diversity in those different structures.
Thanks. We have time for one last question, and it's a question for Vladimir. A number of the participants point out that COVID-19 is not just changing the way we work and the way we work together, but it's going to have a major impact on financial resources that are available for the things that we want to do in this ocean decade. What's our plan for launching the decade during a time where financial resources might be shrinking and we need more?
Thank you for this important question. And it's not only about the money, it is also about the priorities for the world. And I think we also need to be quite ethical in our approach and recognize that health and lives of people are at this moment more important than what we do. So we are looking into a longer term perspective, and we will definitely adjust our plan so for not create a competition for the most important needs of society. And we also have to recognize that the decision-making system in the world is now completely focused on this immediate priority. So this will be definitely taken into account. This affects also the way how and when we are going to propose the plan. This actually gives us also an opportunity to wait a little bit longer, see how the crisis with coronavirus is going away, take into account that it may also go to the southern hemisphere, to all the regions in the world, and at the time, and we will then consolidate the plan, work on the plan for longer time, make the plan stronger. So I think we have also to take advantage in that sense that we can make the plan even better. So, and I would like also to call on everyone to consider this plan in the longer term perspective after the coronavirus but the world is going to change after the coronavirus. The economy will be different, and I hope also that people will be a little bit different in how they address themselves and the environment.
Thanks, Vladimir. Well, we're at the end of our time here, and as expected, we didn't get to all the questions. But as I mentioned in the beginning, please be assured that the IOC Secretariat and everyone involved in this implementation plan will review the full list of questions that have been raised here, and we'll take them into consideration as we complete this final review of the implementation plan. In addition, you'll have another opportunity if you want to provide comments on the implementation plan. After the session, you'll receive a follow-up email inviting you to complete a short survey of 2 open questions. The first is about the implementation plan itself, and really focus on that implementation plan, not sort of the big questions over the next 10 years. And then the second question is about your experience participating in this virtual session. As Allison mentioned, we will be having a number of virtual sessions in the coming year, and we want to do a better job each time of hosting these sessions. Finally, I'd also like to remind you that the slides and the recording of the sessions will be made available online. So before we say goodbye to you all, I'd just like to give Vladimir one last minute or two to kind of wrap up our session today. And thank you all for participating in your excellent questions. Vladimir.
I would like also to thank you, Linwood, and all the panelists for an excellent job. And I would like to thank participants for paying attention and for your excellent questions that show the engagement. I think we have a good plan. And despite the coronavirus, I think this is the plan, not only for the science, this is also the plan for the future to save the ocean, to make the ocean managed. And we have to develop our vision in everyone's brain, how we can move forward with the science towards manage the ocean. And that is exactly the vision that we would like to invite you to continue thinking about and provide to us your most important feedback. So let's do it together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. That concludes our webinar for today.